This is the longbow, the weapon that helped the English to decisively win at the Battle of Crecy. So why am I showing you this weapon? I really don't know, because today, when we're going to talk about Crecy, we're actually going to talk about the Kingston Arms Crecy War Sword. The Battle of Crecy is known as one of the most prominent of the 100 Years' War, and one of the most decisive victories of the English over the French. Though the success was wrought mainly by wood instead of steel, the Crecy War Sword by Kingston Arms represents a considerable amount of time and research into the specifications of single-handed swords of the period, particularly from museum pieces and tapestries. Explicitly crafted to cast Iberia specifications, the Crecy War Sword features a traditional through-tang, pinged pommel handle construction. The forged hollow ground blade possesses a prominent central ridge that tapers the full length of the 32-inch blade, providing support for the cutting edge. The 4 3/8-inch cord-wrapped leather grip is counterbalanced by the stainless pommel for comfortable single-handed fighting. The stainless arched guard pays homage to the English longbowmen who drew victory in the sight of the English King Edward III. The Crecy sword comes with a leather-wrapped wooden scabbard and stainless chape. Here are the specifications of the Kingston Arms Crecy War Sword. The design of this sword is almost wholly focused on the aesthetics. So I'm going to have a lot to say about how aesthetically pleasing this sword is, a lot of the things that are pros, and a few things that I view as cons. But I'm going to start where I always start, and that's the blade. Now I'm actually going to have a lot to say about this blade, because it is actually fairly unique in that you don't very often see a hollow grind blade. Hollow grinding is something that's actually a little bit harder to do in terms of production swords. It takes a little bit more effort, and they did a really good job with it. It's very, very even down the entire length of the blade, and you can see how that comes up to a very nice central ridge. It's really probably hard to tell in a video, but certainly in person you can begin to see it. It is subtle though, and that subtle aspect is a good thing from the aesthetic standpoint. From functionality standpoint, I'll speak to later, it has some drawbacks. They did a very good job as well with the edge bevel, because it is a very large edge bevel in order to sharpen this blade. It fits the overall aesthetics nice. It doesn't look terrible, and overall I have no problems with the way they did the blade. I think the blade, oddly enough, is probably my favorite feature of this sword, and although looking at images online before I ever got it, I would have figured it would have been the hilt that I really liked, because that's what actually stood out to me. So we'll move to that next. This has a Type 11 crossguard. Now, Type 11 is one that isn't used very often in my opinion. I spoke to this when I did the Windless Accolade sword review. I talked about how this kind of crossguard design is one that is rarely used, and I think it actually looks very nice, very handsome, especially on an arming sword. And their choice to use it was actually, they say, inspired by the longbowmen in the Battle of Crecy. Fair enough. Again, I like it when companies draw inspiration instead of always going after just pure historical accuracy. They do like to draw some inspiration and create something that is unique but still grounded in reality, and they've done that here. I like the crossguard, not much more to say about that. The handle is leather wrapped. They did a really good job with the leather wrapping. It's tight, it's very nice, very smooth, and overall it looks very nice. I will say that from a functionality standpoint, there are some drawbacks that they did visually, but then have drawbacks in the functionality section. I'll speak to that. And finally, you have the wheel pommel, and this is, I would say, normally it looks very much like a wheel pommel straight on, but when you look at it from the side, there's actually a nice little taper in it, which I thought was a very interesting design choice, that they actually kind of break up what you would expect to be some sort of symmetry. And I actually kind of like that. Now it's time to talk about some of the drawbacks, and there are a few that I want to speak to. The first has to do with the gap. Now, I always talk about gaps whenever I see them. They aren't nearly as bad as some other swords that I've seen, but there is a visible gap between the crossguard and the blade. And one of the problems that cropped up with this specific one is that it also means that the blade is just barely off of the center line. Not much, but it's there. That's important to note from a functionality standpoint, and I'll get to that later. But also aesthetically, when you're really paying close attention to it, it's a little disappointing to see the blade not be exactly on point. And not only that, but the central ridge is just off of the crossguard as well. Now that might be getting a little bit OCD. I'll be honest, from a distance and for the first week and a half that I handled this sword and looked at it, I didn't notice that. And it wasn't until I got really up close and started being very, very discerning and being a little bit over scrupulous that I began to see that was not quite aligned. It's one of those things that, yeah, it's probably not that big a deal, and it may only be with this one sword. It may only be because there is that slight off-centeredness with the hilt component, but it's something that I did notice. And then finally, the one thing that I think is probably the biggest visual drawback is actually right here at the peen. It is a very, very poor job on the peen, which I'm honestly disappointed in because so much of this sword is so clean and very nice looking, and then the peen looks like just nothing but a bunch of errant strikes happening in order to put this all together. And if there's one thing that I would say aesthetically absolutely needs to change on this sword in future versions that are made, fix the peen job. It can't be that messy. It looks terrible. On a $500 sword, it looks really bad, and I would expect much more. So again, aesthetically, the blade is absolutely the nicest part of this. I love the way this blade looks. It did such a good job with it. The rest of it looks very good, but there are some messy implementations that honestly draw back from the aesthetics just a little bit for the most part. Again, nothing too bad, but things that I want to bring to light and definitely make a point of. With all the effort that Kingston Arms put into choosing the right materials and designing and constructing a sword properly to be very, very functional, there are two rather minor issues, but because they can be combined, create one really large issue when you're beginning to talk about the functionality of this sword. It's not necessarily a drawback per se, but it's something that I really feel is necessary to highlight for someone who might want to get this sword to use functionally a great deal. So the first minor drawback is the weight. It's an arming sword, and arming swords can have a large variety of weight. This one comes in at just under 3 pounds. So close to 3 pounds, we might as well just call it 3 pounds. And 3 pounds is the upper end of the arming sword weight. You don't really want to go too much heavier than that. That in and of itself is not a problem. That, generally speaking, can result in some exhaustion over time in trying to do cut tests or things like that. You'll end up getting tired over time and you take a break. Or you'll build up strength, I suppose. But the other issue that combines with that and has kind of a detrimental effect is right here at the grip. So, we call the grip for a reason, because you grip it, and it should also kind of grip back. The leather they chose ends up feeling very slick. I'm going to hold on to the cross for this for a moment to show you. Holding on to this, and I'm holding on pretty tight, my hand will slip. Okay? I'm not holding on super tight, I'm holding on as tight as I would expect to, holding like a sword. That gives a feeling that this could slip out of your hand, and because of that, you really want to white knuckle grip it. You want to hold it so tightly that you end up really exhausting yourself, combining that heavy grip along with the extra weight. When you are cut testing or you're just swinging it around, whatever you might be doing with this sword from a functional standpoint, you just get exhausted very quickly. I mean, very quickly. Now, I like to think that I'm actually fairly strong, that I can actually do cut tests for a rather extended period of time compared to how I used to be able to do before I had, built myself up to that. but I found this one very exhausting. Not to say that it wasn't fun to cut with. In fact, it's really good at cutting. My cut tests were very successful. It had a very nice edge. It got through all my targets very well. It wasn't until I was trying to do a very specific cut pattern, which is starting on the left side and doing a false edge cut up angle, so under, and then following that up with also left-hand cut over angle on the true edge, that I found that I was having difficulty. I just was getting tired, and I couldn't really control it as well as I needed to. Not so much in the target or the orientation of the blade, but more of just the speed. And it wasn't until I kind of gripped with my second hand, which you shouldn't really have to do with an arming sword, to kind of give myself the extra strength, was I able to do that cut. Now, it's a little bit disappointing, but I would imagine with some effort and with some extra practice, maybe I could develop a little bit more endurance using a sword like this. However, I think that that is a rather large drawback, because you want the grip to feel comfortable. You don't want to have to hold it so tightly in order for it to feel like it's going to stay in your hand, and it really should never have the feeling that it's going to slip. So the weight in and of itself may not be ideal, but it isn't the worst thing in the world. The grip being not so grippy in and of itself, if that was the only issue, it may not be as big a deal. Combination of the two, I found it to be very problematic. That said, overall, the rest of the functionality it seems to be pretty much perfectly fine. Again, as I said in the aesthetic section, there is kind of a slight offset of the hilt and the blade. During cut tests, I never noticed that. It didn't really impact anything, so I don't feel like that alone was a drawback from functionality perspective, although I like for things to be very well aligned. Also, this grip is a little bit beefier, so it's a little bit hard to tell your edge alignment from grip alone. It's not completely round, so you don't really run into that issue, but it is worth noting that it's a little bit harder just to gauge edge alignment on feeling alone. All that said, it's functional. It was actually a great deal of fun to cut with, and I won't really knock off too many points from the functionality standpoint, except to say that if they could fix these problems, if they could maybe thin out the blade a little bit, you can still keep the hollow ground design, but maybe not have such a thick central ridge, to just lighten it up a bit and choose a better way of doing the grip, it would be a fantastic sword. Fun functionally, but it does have those drawbacks. Overall, this sword is pretty much exactly what you would want in a nice arming sword. It looks very nice visually. From a functionality standpoint, it's pretty much there. It could use a few small improvements. And certainly I will say that for a $500 sword, I would maybe expect a little bit more, just in terms of making sure that it is nearly perfect aesthetically, specifically speaking to, again, the errant strikes in peening the whole thing together, as well as just kind of the minor drawbacks with functionality, specifically maybe finding a way to lighten the blade a bit and taking care of the type of leather that's used in the grip to make sure it's not so slippery, as it were, or not so slick feeling. I will also speak to the fact this does come with a scabbard. It's an extremely basic scabbard. They've got basically kind of two horizontal little ridges and one long ridge, and a really basic shape. Nothing really to speak to in terms of drawbacks on this. It fits just fine, putting it all together. It holds the sword. It slips a little bit. And I think I mentioned that in the unboxing video I did, that it does have a little bit of a slip to it. And that slip, at first I thought might just be because of it needing to kind of be degreased a bit from all the packaging and shipping. But it still kind of doesn't hug as snugly as I want it to. But that said, it's also not a huge drawback, because for the most part it does stay in the scabbard. Nothing really too special about the scabbard, though, in my opinion. It works nice as a package deal, and that's what you're getting. This sword and a scabbard for the $500 price mark. You're not getting a belt or anything else. Overall, it's a functional sword. It's got a unique design. They chose inspiration that I thought was a very interesting choice for inspiration, and they even call that out. And I like that they put that thought into it, because again, while I really like replicas and recreations of museum pieces and historical pieces, it's also nice to see things that are simply being inspired by and grounded in reality. Not much more to say about this sword in particular. If you're looking for a hollow ground arming sword, if you're looking for an arming sword that has the kind of Type 11 cross, well, especially if you're looking for those two things together, this is pretty much your sword. I don't think I would say that you shouldn't go after this one, although I do feel like those might be the things that you really need to be looking for in an arming sword in order to make this your choice above all the other options out there. Overall, good sword, functional, fun to cut with, hard to cut with, and a very beautiful design that I think is very appeasing and very, very enjoyable. This is it. This is the Kingston Arms Cressy War Sword. I give it a 3.5 out of 5.